It's Levi Brackman here with Truth's Jewish Wisdom for today. Thank you so much for joining. This is another episode of Torah Portion Uncensored. We are coming to the end of Leviticus, and this week's Torah portion is Behar. And the entire Behar is one chapter, chapter 25. But before I jump into that, I just want to say that it's great to be back home. I have been on the road for a number of weeks and been recording from the road. And I even missed 1 week because I was so busy traveling. But now I am home, back into my routine of studying. If you like this episode and you like the content that I share here, please review, like it, wherever you listen to this podcast, whether that be on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that allows other people to also find this content. Now, to jump into the Torah portion of Behar. On a high level, Behar is talking about Shmita and Yovel, or Shmita and Yovel. That each seventh year the land rests, one doesn't work in the land, one doesn't work in the vineyard. When you have a series of 7 times 7, which is 49, so every 7th Shmita, so the 49th year you have a Shmita, and then the 50th year, that is Yovel, that is the Jubilee year. And on the Jubilee year, the land rests again. So it rests for 2 years, on the 7th year and on the 50th year. So 7 times 7 each 7th year, the 49th year it will rest, and then again it will rest on the 50th year. And why does the Torah care so much about the land resting on the 7th year? And why does it make a big deal of the 50th year as being the year of the Jubilee, and on the 10th day of the 7th month, on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, is commemorated and the shofar is blown, etc. So what is the significance of these series of 7 years when the land rests and on the 50th year? If you read the idea of the Shmita, of the 7th year which the land rests, Shabbat, Shabbaton, that it's a Sabbath to the land, and Yovel, which is the Jubilee year, if you read that as like an introduction or the framework, then you understand how the rest of the contents of the chapter fits in. It seems that this chapter is really all about how to have a healthy society. If you look at the details of the chapter, then you see a framework for a society that can really work. And from understanding what the Torah doesn't want us to do, one can learn what the Torah sees as a positive type of society. Let's jump in and go through some of the details. So what is the symbolism? What is the purpose of these 7 years where the land rests on the 7th year and the Jubilee year? Well, there's 2 things that happen on the 7th year, and it's not stated explicitly in this chapter, but these 2 things happen on the 7th year. Number 1, Jewish slaves go free on the 7th year. Secondly, all loans which are made become abolished on the 7th year. And in addition to that, the land rests on the 7th year. Now, what happens if the person who was enslaved says, I want to stay? That person stays until the 50th year, until Yovel, and then Yovel, his master, has to let him free. So that's a little bit of the context of this. So this 7th year of rest also has implications for commerce and for people's status within society. That if you are a slave, then you will go free. That is context to this idea of the Shmita. There are additional aspects related here which explain this framework. So the Torah explains that one shouldn't do something called oinah. What does oinah mean? You shouldn't wrong your fellow. And one of the ways in which you can wrong your fellow is when you buy some land, you buy it according to how much use you're going to have out of this land. Now, bearing in mind that there is a law found in this chapter which says that if you have a slave, as I mentioned, then he has to go free on the Yovel year, but also relates to property, that on the year of the Yovel, on that 50th year, on the Jubilee year, land also gets returned to the original owner. So you have a lease on land, and that land is a 50-year lease at maximum. If you are 10 years before the Yovel and you want to sell the land, well, then you're only going to sell the land for the usage that you can get out of it for 10 years. What if it's 2 years before Yovel? Then it's going to be less expensive, because you're only selling it for the usage that you can get for 2 seasons, etc. So the Torah warns that one shouldn't wrong one's fellow. One has to be accurate when one sells the land of how much is left till Yovel, and based on that is the price of the land which is sold for the lease. So that's one aspect. Don't wrong your fellow. And then it says again, don't wrong your fellow. And the rabbis understand that the second form of oinah, the second form of wronging, is giving people bad advice. And the kind of bad advice you might give in business is because, well, you might tell somebody, this is actually not a good property to buy. Why? Because you don't want them to buy it, so you can come and buy it. So don't give people bad advice in business. Give people honest advice, the same kind of advice that you would give yourself, so that you shouldn't wrong people in business. That's another aspect which is found here. And on the idea of wronging someone, it says the following: This is verse 18 in chapter 25, and it says, you should do my statutes and my judgments, you should keep, and you should do them, so that you should dwell on the land securely. So how can you dwell on the land securely as a people? Don't wrong people in business. Don't cheat people in business. And then it goes on to talk about not taking interest. If you lend people money, you shouldn't lend them money on interest. In other words, you shouldn't allow yourself to make money from the money that you're lending somebody. So if you lend someone $1,000, they should give you back $1,000. They shouldn't give you back based on an interest rate for the money which you lent them. So that's another aspect that is found related to loans, which is related to this whole idea of Shmita, which is lending people money. The loans end up being wiped out on Shmita, but also together with that, you have this idea of that you shouldn't lend people money on interest. And then it goes on to talk about what happens if someone has reason to sell themselves into slavery. Say they get so much into debt, they need to pay back that debt, so they sell themselves into slavery to another Jewish person. Then it says that you have to treat the person well. You can't treat them like a slave, but you must treat them like a worker, like someone who you pay for their work and time, either yearly or daily. And not only that, it says in verse 40, he should be like someone who you've hired, like a resident with you. And the sages go to town on this idea of with you, that you should be with him. He should be eating the same kind of food as you. You should be sleeping in the same kind of bed. You shouldn't be giving him an inferior bed. You should also be drinking the same type of wine. In other words, you shouldn't be drinking some kind of expensive wine and giving him the inexpensive wine, etc. He should be with you. You should be treating him like a human being, like an individual, and see him just the same as you, not any lower than you. And then it talks about that you shouldn't overload him with work. You need to give him work which isn't overly burdensome to him, and it says that twice. And then it says, and if a Jew gets sold to a non-Jew, one is obligated to redeem that person from the non-Jewish master, and then you can then have him as a slave, as a Jewish slave, where you need to treat him with that kind of respect and dignity in lieu of whatever money that you spent in order to redeem him from the non-Jewish master. So this, in a nutshell, are the laws associated with this particular chapter. Now, the reason why I've gone through all these laws is because in order to get an accurate view of what is going on here and what I think the Torah is trying to present as a positive society, as a model society, one in which you can actually live in safety and security on your land, one needs to be able to see the entire picture. And what emerges from this is the idea that you can't have multiple classes in a society. Think about the idea of interest, for example. If you have an ability to lend people with interest, then you, the person with the money have a certain power that the person without the money doesn't have. As a matter of fact, you're giving that person money, and then that person has to work harder to give you back not just the money which you lent them, but even more money on top of it, the interest. That creates a significant imbalance of power, and in a sense, that would create a certain kind of servitude that the borrower would have towards the lender. In addition, if you allow some people to buy property and those people then can keep that property forever, you end up with the class of people who own property, the landlords, and a class of people who are renting from their landlords. And you would end up very quickly with all the property being concentrated into the hands of the property owners, and all the rest of the people then, the only way they can use the property is by renting from that person. And if you're renting from that person, then you have to work on the land, because in those days it was an agricultural economy. You would have to work on the land, and instead of being able to get all the produce from that land and keeping it for yourself and to feed your family and to sell in the marketplace, you would have to give some of that to the person who owns it. So the person who owns it, that person gets rent without doing anything. Someone else works hard and they get rent. It's very similar to the idea of interest, that you give the person money, and not only do they have to give you the money back, but they also have to give you money on top of that, the interest. It's the ultimate of revenue without having to work for it. The same thing is if you have real estate and the other person works on the land, produces the produce, and you just sit back and you get rent for it without working hard for it. You end up with two levels of people, the person who works and then the person who just gains. And the Torah doesn't want a society where you have these two classes of people. Ultimately, what that would lead to is a kind of slave class, or class of people who are servants. And that might happen anyway, because people do mistakes in business, they get into debt, etc. And sometimes they'll have to sell all of their labor up front to get a lump sum to be able to pay back the debt. And now they're in servitude for a number of years. So that might happen. But you don't want a class of people who are working, and from their work, revenue is generated, and that revenue then goes to another class of people who are the slave owners. So every 7 years, the slaves go back, and they are no longer slaves, and they become regular free people again. They get a second lease on life, if you like. And if they want to stay as slaves, they can do so, but after 50 years, they definitely have to return, them and their family and everyone else. So you don't end up with this slave class in the society. Now, that doesn't rule out the idea of slavery entirely, because it does say in this chapter that if you do want to have slaves, then you can have slaves from other nations, other people. Just you can't have slaves from your own society, because you don't want to end up with these two classes in society, the slave class and the master class. That would be a sum negative. Why? Because there would be one class which is making the money and just sitting back, and the other class which is working hard. So all these things fall into this category, whether it's making money from interest, whether it's making money from land, whether it's having slaves work for you, and you are just owning those people and you don't have to work. That would all lead to two classes. One class of person who is sitting back while money is made through the efforts of others. And that ends up being very negative for society, because you end up with these two very distinct classes of people. The workers, who would be seen as inferior, and the owners of the slaves, the owners of the land, and the owners of the money, the cash, and everyone else then is in some form of slavery to those people. There's fundamentally two reasons for it. Why this would be considered negative. One, which is obvious, that if you have a society like that, where you have the overlords, and then you have the slaves, or the people working for those overlords, you end up with a situation where you just can't have a cohesive society. You end up with two very distinct classes. And you already have very distinct classes in the society set up by the Torah. One class is the priestly class, and then there's everybody else. But that priestly class doesn't own property. They don't make money. They work in the tabernacle. They work for the service of God. So that is already one very distinct class. If you end up allowing these things, you end up with other two classes, which is just not healthy. You end up with the people of the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots are always in servitude to the haves, and that ends up being very, very negative. You don't have a middle class at all. And what the Torah wants to create is a society which has a very broad middle class and doesn't have a very wealthy class and a very, very poor class. The poor people are constantly being forced out of poverty by the fact that if they end up in slavery, they get out every 7 years. If they end up in debt, their debt ends up being wiped out every 7 years. There can't be any idea here of just the property owners and the renters. There can't be a situation where the borrowers are paying a lot of interest. None of these things can happen, and because of that, you end up with a society which can basically hum along without going to any of the extremes, where some people go to extreme poverty and some people go to extreme wealth. You more or less have a well-regulated society without extreme wealth or extreme poverty. It's not a type of communism where everyone is forced to be equal because people can do commerce, but it is a situation where you can't have any of the extreme wealth gathering that you would have in a capitalistic society. The other reason it seems why the Torah doesn't like this is because it doesn't like the idea of people not working. As it says, Adam la'amal yulad, a person is born to work. Every person has to work and do something productive. If you end up with a situation where you have the class which owns real estate and the class which rents that real estate, and then the agricultural work which they do in the field, and they just give it to the people who own it without the owners doing any real work for it, then you have a whole class of people who are just making money without working for it. And the same thing with interest. And the same thing is with having slaves. These all fall into the category that the owners don't really work hard for anything. And the Torah wants a society where people work hard for their money. People are able to value the idea of working hard and therefore value that money which comes out of putting in a whole long hard day's work. So there is a value in actually working the fields oneself. There is value of going out there and actually making a living, and not just living off someone else's hard work. So this idea of actually working hard, the Torah wants everyone to have to do that. And therefore, the idea of accepting interest, or the idea of just being a landlord while someone else works the land properly, then you just get some money skimmed off from the work which they do, that is not considered to be a society which would be positive, because you end up with people who just don't work hard. And the society that the Torah wants to create is a society where everyone works hard. So in a nutshell, if you had to put together what this chapter 25 of Leviticus, Perek Chaf Hei of Vayikra, is all about, it's about the framework needed for the ultimate type of society that the Torah wants to create. How should people live their lives? And the answer to that is, number one, you should live your life in a way in which you actually work hard and put in effort in order to be able to survive. Number two, we don't want a society where we have some people in a higher class and some people in the lower class. Even if you have a slave, you need to understand that that slave is your brother, and you're no better than that slave. And you have to treat them just as well as you treat yourself. So the idea of having a society where you have higher people in society and lower people in society, people who you look down upon, people who you give bad advice to, that's the other idea. You can't give bad advice to people. You might be a person who has their advice, but you need to be fair to them, and you can't wrong them, because that's another way of gaining something unjustly and unfairly without working hard for it, because you cheat the person. So the idea here is that you need to be careful. The way you live your life is such that you see people as equals, you treat them as equals, and you understand the value of hard work, and you understand the value of putting in effort to make money, and don't just try to make money from money itself or from other people's effort without putting in the effort yourself. And if you have a society like that, that is a sustainable society. That is a society which will be secure. And it's understandable how that will be secure, because when people feel that they're all treated as equals and everyone has a fair chance like everybody else, and if they fall down, they get a chance to start over again, then there's no reason for people to fight with each other. There's no reason for people to hate each other. And you end up with a fair and equitable society. And then you can actually live securely. In Pasuk Yud Ches, that is the word that is given, to live, v'yishavtim al haaretz levetach, and you will be able to dwell in the land in security, because security comes about when people feel that they're all given a fair chance and people don't feel that they're treated in an unequal way. The other thing which is really interesting here is that in this chapter it gives a reason for all of this. It says, because you are slaves to me, God says. God says, because you were slaves to me. And the idea here is that if you are already slaves to somebody else, then you're all equal. You're all slaves. If you're all slaves to God, then you can't take someone else's slave and make them a slave. In other words, the idea here is that since everyone is a slave to God, everyone in this society is a slave to God, everyone here has a responsibility of serving God, you can't say this person is my slave, because what do you mean? The person has already got servitude. Yes, people can have different roles in the society, but the ultimate is that everyone is already a slave to God and can't therefore be a slave to somebody else. So God says, you're all my slaves. And by you being all my slaves, therefore you can't be anyone else's slaves. And therefore you can't treat other people as slaves. And as slaves, you're all equal. So whilst it's very difficult to see how this in the long term would actually work, I think the values behind these ideas are very important to take to heart and to understand. I think that these are timeless values that we can have if we want to live in a society which is going to be secure. And those timeless values are as follows. Number one, don't mistreat other people. Don't cheat other people. But fundamentally, see people as equals. Give people a chance, and a second chance, and a third chance. That when people fall down, allow them to get back up and reestablish themselves. And don't have the society stacked against some people that they can never get out of poverty. Always allow people to be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and give them a helping hand so they can get back on track, so they have some kind of vision and some kind of ability to get back into that middle class. And also, don't set up a society where some people can become mega wealthy while other people become incredibly poor. You need an ability not by taking money away from one and giving it to the other, but by having a mechanism which allows people to have mobility from being very poor all the way through back into the middle class, and a society which doesn't allow some people to accumulate so much that they become incredibly wealthy at the detriment to everybody else who can end up being incredibly poor. These are timeless values. And when we see a society which is starting to become out of whack, either some people are getting incredibly poor, or some people, the accumulation of wealth ends up being incredibly high compared to everybody else, then we know that we're getting out of whack, and then we should try and return to these, what I consider to be timeless biblical values. This has been Levi Brackman with Truth's Jewish Wisdom for Today, our Torah Portion Uncensored series. Thank you so much for joining, and until next time.